Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back into the quiet, candlelit corridors of old palaces. So, if you're settling under a blanket, adjusting your pillow, or just letting your day melt away, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to wander, very gently, into a question that has bothered historians, gossip lovers, and possibly a few ancient monarchs themselves. A question that feels soft on the surface, but underneath has many sharp, uncomfortable little edges. How did royal servants survive when they knew far too much? Because they always did. They were the silent witnesses, the people in the room when they absolutely shouldn't have been. They were the human furniture that kings and queens completely forgot could hear, see, and remember. And unfortunately for those servants, remembering was often the most dangerous thing they could do. So let's drift into their world, slowly, quietly. Because, if we're being honest, the walls of a medieval palace were thin, the secrets were thick, and the people holding those secrets had a remarkable tendency to disappear if they weren't careful. Let's begin in the ancient Near East, where royal courts perfected the art of making their servants feel both essential and deeply replaceable, a comforting combination. In Assyria, palace servants existed in a state of gentle panic. The king was considered divinely chosen, like a very moody extension of the gods. And the people around him, the scribes, the cupbearers, the bedchamber attendants, were expected to radiate loyalty so pure it could almost be measured by weight. Naturally, this resulted in an environment where everyone overperformed. If a cupbearer's job was to pour wine, he did it with the enthusiasm of a man trying to prevent the apocalypse, because in his mind, he was. The Assyrian kings were famously paranoid. It's not entirely their fault. When you run an empire through fear and public displays of "don't mess with me," you do get a little jumpy. So the servants developed what scholars today might politely call survival strategies. The most popular one was not reacting at all. A king could have a meltdown, fire a javelin at a wall, blame the gods, and accuse 3 planets of being out to get him. And the servants would stand there like mildly bored pine trees. You couldn't laugh. You couldn't gasp. You couldn't even raise an eyebrow. Eyebrows were dangerous in ancient empires. What you could do was blend so thoroughly into the background that, with any luck, the king forgot you were a sentient organism. Some servants did this so well, they effectively became decorative. And this was the safest route.
Because the moment you became noticeable, you became memorable. And the moment you became memorable, your lifespan became negotiable. Now, drifting to Egypt, where secrets flowed like the Nile, and servants were expected to hold them like clay pots balanced on their heads. Egyptian palaces were full of information that absolutely no one wanted to be responsible for. For example, who Pharaoh was sleeping with, who Pharaoh was not sleeping with, which could also be a political crisis, who had insulted which god by accident, and which priest was claiming that a crocodile sneezed in a way that foretold doom. It was exhausting. So, how did Egyptian servants survive? They leaned into silence, almost religiously. Egyptians had a word for this ideal servant quality, sedjem, meaning to hear, not to speak, not to repeat, just listen, absorb. Say absolutely nothing unless your job required it, which it often didn't. This turned royal servants into something like early model surveillance devices. They listened, they remembered, they carried everything. And the strange part? It worked. Most Egyptian servants lived surprisingly long lives, partly because the administration valued continuity, and partly because, well, executing all your loyal palace staff every time you had an embarrassing moment would get expensive. Still, servants knew the unspoken rule. If the pharaoh hasn't asked for your opinion, pretend you don't have one. This was generally excellent advice, especially when you consider that Egyptian rulers were prone to dramatic political swings. One day you're in a stable dynasty. The next day, a new pharaoh rises, announces that the sun god is the only god, and you're expected to smile like this wasn't a theological earthquake. Servants survived by adjusting instantly. If the king wanted monotheism today, but went back to polytheism tomorrow, the servants nodded, bowed, and internally said, "Of course, naturally, we always loved this Persian." It was, in many ways, an early masterclass in workplace adaptability. But perhaps the most fascinating group of royal staff, the ones who really lived on the edge of knowing too much, were the bedroom attendants in ancient Persia. These were the people who literally stood next to the king's sleeping man. They knew who visited him. They saw who left. They heard the whispered conversations that could make or break political alliances. They were the invisible witnesses to the empire's most private moments. And the Persians, being exceptionally practical, solved the too many secrets problem in their own neat way. They built loyalty through privilege, real privilege. A good bedroom servant could become powerful, wealthy, influential. But here's the twist. Once you reached a certain level of trust, you couldn't leave. Ever. It was the ancient Persian equivalent of those software terms and conditions that you can't escape. Except instead of losing your data privacy, you lost your ability to change jobs without facing consequences, which was a polite court word for, "Let's not do this." In other words, be loyal, be helpful, enjoy your rise, but don't go anywhere. The servants understood. They stayed. It was safer that way. Let's drift a bit further west, into Greece, where Greek servants of powerful households lived in a more socially flexible world. Except for one small issue. Greek elites loved gossip. They loved it in the same way modern people love reality TV, except theirs had fewer commercial breaks and slightly more philosophical discussions. Greek servants were constantly surrounded by drama, which was fine until the drama involved political rivalries or personal scandals that absolutely couldn't get out. The Greeks had a solution to this, too. Several, actually. One was fear. Plain old-fashioned fear. If you were a slave or servant and you revealed something sensitive, you could be whipped, imprisoned, or sold into a particularly unpleasant kind of labor, the kind where you deeply regret your commitment to storytelling. Another solution was social invisibility. Servants moved quietly. They observed. They remembered. And they rarely spoke because Greek courts had a terrible habit of dragging servants in for testimony, which, to be legally valid, required torture.
Yes, they believed people only told the truth while in pain. Naturally, this meant servants tried extremely hard to know nothing at all. The safest Greek servant was the one who could convincingly claim, "I was in the other room, pretending to count olives." It's unclear whether this worked, but they tried. Then we drift into Rome, because no discussion of royal secrets would be complete without Rome, a civilization that weaponized palace gossip. The Julio-Claudian emperors, in particular, were the sort of people who could turn a minor rumor into a full-scale investigation involving exile, poison, and a senator nervously sweating through his toga. So how did imperial servants survive? They perfected a state of gentle, purposeful stupidity. Not real stupidity, just a carefully curated appearance of being less informed than they actually were. If an emperor's mistress visited at midnight, the servants did not see. If someone exited the emperor's bedroom looking disheveled, they did not notice.
If the emperor shouted at the gods for giving him a disappointing horoscope, the servants heard absolutely nothing. One Roman historian described palace staff as ears without mouths. Another called them the quiet eyes of the empire. And another just described them as people who knew too much but wisely pretended otherwise. Some servants survived by aligning themselves subtly with the empress. Others quietly allied with the emperor's mother. Still others found a comfortable niche in being so unassuming that no one remembered their name long enough to accuse them of anything. The truth is, in Rome, the safest thing you could be was forgettable, preferably in a brown tunic. The moment you stood out, say as a competent administrator or an unusually intelligent attendant, you became a threat or a tool. Both options were terrifying. But perhaps the most quietly tragic secret keepers of all were the young female attendants of medieval courts. These were girls, sometimes barely teenagers, who served queens, princesses, and noblewomen. They dressed them, braided their hair, helped them bathe, listened to their whispered fears about childbirth, political alliances, or husbands who preferred hunting boars to holding conversations. These girls knew everything. Who the queen trusted, who she feared, who she maybe liked a little too much, and who might be plotting against her. And because they were women, living in a world where rumors could destroy lives, their knowledge was especially volatile. So how did they survive? Most relied on the oldest strategy in the book. They kept their mouths shut, completely. If they spoke, they whispered only to each other, and even then, very carefully, because medieval courts had spies everywhere, even among the servants themselves.
A careless comment could be overheard, twisted, and carried to the wrong ears. And suddenly, a maid could find herself reassigned, dismissed, or quietly removed from the record. Some women survived by developing powerful patrons. A queen's affection could protect a servant. A duchess's loyalty could shield a handmaiden. But these protections were fragile. A change in dynasty could make yesterday's trusted attendant into today's liability. Many simply learned to become shadows. Soft steps, soft eyes, soft voices. Unnoticed, undramatic, unproblematic. Because surviving a royal court, for most of history, meant being present, but never intrusive. Helpful, but never ambitious. Loyal, but never too loyal to the wrong person. And so, when we ask the question, how did royal servants survive when they knew too many secrets? The answer is quiet, soft, and a little sad. They survived by shrinking themselves, by tucking their thoughts away, by living in the silent space between what they knew and what they could safely say. They survived by mastering the art of invisibility. And in a way, that's the real story here. The ancient world is full of kings and queens, emperors and empresses, loud, dramatic people with loud, dramatic lives. But behind them were thousands of silent figures, people who kept the world running while pretending they weren't there. People whose lives depended on being unnoticed. People who carried secrets they could never share. Let's drift gently now, toward the next corner of royal life. Another group of people bound by the same strange dance of power, loyalty, and danger. Because there is still so much more to explore in these quiet corridors of history.
Last time, we eased into the quiet world of servants, who survived by knowing everything and saying nothing. But tonight,
we're going to float toward a different kind of court figure. One who lived a little closer to danger, a little closer to the royal ear, and sometimes closer to the royal bed. These were the favorites. The people who rose from nowhere, sometimes literally the hallway, to positions of astonishing influence, and naturally, astonishing risk. Now, favorite sounds sweet. It's the kind of label you might give a pet cat or a comfortable chair. But in royal terms, it meant something very different. Someone the monarch liked a little too much. Maybe they were charming. Maybe they were good at flattery. Maybe they were simply nearby when the king was bored, which is often how political history is shaped. So tonight, let's drift into their world, softly. No rush, no drama, just the calm realization that for centuries, entire nations were shaped by people who, technically speaking, weren't supposed to be in charge of anything. Let's begin quietly in medieval England, where the concept of the royal favorite became something of a national pastime. Take Piers Gaveston, a man who rose so close to King Edward II that chroniclers describe their relationship using carefully vague language, the kind of language historians use when they know exactly what they want to say, but are also trying not to offend anyone's grandmother. Gaveston was handsome, confident, a bit of a show-off, and Edward adored him. The nobles, however, did not. Nothing irritated a medieval nobleman quite like watching a man of inferior birth, which usually meant someone whose family tree didn't look like a distorted coat rack, rise past them in influence. Gaveston dressed extravagantly. He joked too freely. He once mocked a nobleman by calling him the Black Dog. You can imagine how well that went over. But the real reason he was hated, he knew too much. He heard everything Edward worried about, every unfiltered thought, every private frustration. A royal favorite was dangerous not because they wielded weapons, but because they wielded information. And Gaveston paid the price for it. Captured, dragged to a field, executed by nobles who were tired of being upstaged by a man with better cheekbones. Edward mourned him deeply. One of the rare times in medieval Europe when you see a king actually break composure. The lesson was clear. In royal courts, intimacy was a liability, especially if it came with influence. Drifting forward, we gently land in France, specifically the Valois courts, where royal favorites were practically a genre. King Charles VI had a favorite named Pierre de Jacques. Pierre's essential talent was flattery. Not in a loud, exuberant way, more in the gentle, I support you unconditionally even though you're making catastrophic political choices way. Charles, unfortunately, suffered from debilitating episodes of mental illness. During his delirious periods, he once forgot who he was. Another time, he believed he was made of glass and refused to sit down for fear of shattering. The court responded with its usual wisdom, arguing, panicking, and blaming each other. But Pierre stayed calm, listened, kept the king soothed, and almost certainly shielded him from the full chaos swirling around the throne. Naturally, this made him unpopular. Being the only stable human in a collapsing political environment is a great way to get labeled suspicious. When Charles's wife, Queen Isabeau, wanted more power, she removed Pierre in the usual medieval fashion, quietly, efficiently, and with complete deniability. Pierre was drowned in a river, a method that was considered discreet, because nothing says this was politically motivated like tying someone's hands and pretending they slipped. The story shows the strange paradox of royal favorites. They were trusted completely by the monarch and distrusted completely by everyone else.
Let's drift softly now to Spain, home of some of the most powerful and doomed royal favorites in European history. King Philip III relied heavily on one man, the Duke of Lerma. The Duke was charming, smooth, politically savvy, and had absolutely no intention of remaining a humble servant. He ran the kingdom. He controlled finances. He appointed his friends to top positions. He created a network so tight that even the king struggled to make decisions without him. Some said the Duke discovered the secret of royal power. Be the one who tells the king what he wants to hear, especially when what he wants to hear is, "Everything is fine, Your Majesty. You're doing wonderfully." But here's the comforting part. Royal favorites rarely stayed on top for long. Eventually, the Duke's enemies cornered him. His solution was brilliant in a very "what on earth" way. He became a cardinal. Yes, he joined the church so no one could legally prosecute him. It was, perhaps, the most elegant escape plan in European history. One moment he's managing the Spanish Empire, the next he's wearing robes and pretending to be deeply concerned with spiritual matters. And all because he knew too much. Now let's drift even more gently into the world of royal mistresses, women whose influence was whispered about behind every curtain and door. These women weren't servants, but they lived in the same dangerous orbit of intimate knowledge. They held emotional power. They held secrets the queen didn't want revealed, and secrets the king didn't want traced back. One of the most fascinating examples is Agnes Sorel, mistress of King Charles VII of France. She arrived at court wearing gowns so low cut that chroniclers struggled to describe them without fainting. She wore pearls, diamonds, silk. She practically glowed. Naturally, she became influential. Charles trusted her, listened to her, even allowed her to advise him on political matters. This made everyone uncomfortable, especially the nobility, who preferred their kings influenced by respectable men, not fashionable young women. Agnes died suddenly at 28, officially from dysentery. Unofficially, people whispered poisoning, because royal mistresses often knew too much. They knew which noble had insulted the king, which ambassador had angered him, which policies he regretted.
A mistress with information was powerful. A mistress with too much information was disposable. Agnes remains a quiet example of how dangerous royal affection could be. Let's float now toward Russia, where royal favorites reached new levels of unpredictability. Catherine the Great was famous for many things: her intelligence, her ambition, her massive library, and of course, her favorites. Catherine selected young, charming men. She gifted them estates, money, jewelry, and often just enough power to make them feel important without giving them the ability to cause trouble. One favorite, Grigory Orlov, helped Catherine overthrow her husband. Naturally, this gave him considerable political leverage, for a while. But Catherine was practical.
Once Orlov stopped being useful and started being merely dramatic, she replaced him quietly. Yet she cared enough to give him a generous retirement package, thousands of rubles, a palace, and a life far away from politics. This was the dream scenario for a royal favorite. Rise to power, then leave before someone poisons you. Unfortunately, it was rare, because favorites lived in a world where everything depended on one person's mood, their affection, their whims. One bad day, one wrong expression, one careless sentence, and a favorite could fall faster than anyone else in the court. Now, let's drift to a quieter corner of Europe, the courts of Scandinavia. Here, favorites were sometimes elevated not because they were charming or clever, but because the king felt lonely. Christian VII of Denmark is a perfect example. He suffered from severe mental illness, leaving him anxious, confused, and emotionally unstable. Into his life walked Johann Struensee, a doctor, calm, intelligent, exactly the sort of person who could soothe a troubled mind. Struensee became Christian's confidant, his advisor, his emotional anchor, and eventually the man who ran Denmark. He introduced reforms, improved the legal system, modernized the state, all while caring for a king who barely understood what was happening around him. Naturally, the nobles despised this arrangement. A foreign doctor running the kingdom? Impossible, unacceptable, and worst of all, efficient. Their solution was simple: arrest him, charge him with overstepping authority, and execute him. Which they did. Struensee's story is one of the gentlest tragedies in European history. A quiet man who tried to help, a king who needed him, and a court that couldn't tolerate someone so close to power. It's a pattern we see again and again. Royal favorites rise because they're kind, or loyal, or clever, or simply there at the right moment. And they fall because courts are allergic to anyone who isn't easily controlled. So when we ask, how did royal favorites survive their dangerous positions, the answer is softly obvious. They usually didn't. Not for long. They lived on borrowed time, borrowed affection, borrowed influence. Their presence was always temporary, their knowledge always a liability, their closeness to power always a silent threat to everyone else. They were the brightest candles in the room, and inevitably, they burned out.
We're drifting into another quiet corner of palace life, one that sits right on the edge of fear and routine. We're moving to the people whose job was both simple and existentially terrifying: the food tasters. The men and women who took tiny bites of royal meals so kings and queens didn't accidentally drop dead before dessert. It sounds dramatic, but don't worry. Our pace tonight stays slow and soft. No sudden scares, no intense visuals, just the quiet anxiety of someone thinking, "I really hope this soup doesn't kill me," while maintaining a polite expression. Let's settle into their world. Food tasters have existed in royal courts for thousands of years, essentially since the moment rulers realized that all their enemies, and sometimes their family members, had access to plants, powders, and various mysterious substances that produced unfortunate outcomes. So, naturally, they invented a job for someone else. In Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, China, Japan, and medieval Europe, it was considered completely normal for someone to taste the king's food before he did. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, it wasn't even respected. It was just necessary, in the same quiet, resigned way that taking out the trash is necessary. The taster usually had two goals each day:
don't die, convince the king the food is safe. Preferably in that order. Let's drift back to ancient Rome, where food tasting was practically a full-time sport. The emperors lived in constant fear of poison, mostly because they poisoned each other so regularly that it became a normal political strategy. Emperor Claudius had a dedicated taster named Helotus. Helotus was quiet, discreet, and excellent at not dying, which made him very good at his job. The irony, of course, is that Claudius himself was poisoned, not Helotus, not the taster, the emperor. Which raises a few questions about Helotus's performance. To be fair, Claudius's wife, Agrippina, was responsible, and she likely used a trick that bypassed the taster entirely. Some sources say the poison was added to a dish after Helotus tasted it, which feels a bit like cheating, but royal families were not known for following sporting regulations. After the assassination, Helotus continued serving the next emperor. Apparently, Rome decided that if he'd managed not to be poisoned himself, he must have been doing something right. Or, more realistically, no one wanted his job. Let's drift east to ancient Persia, where the court took poisoning fears to new, luxurious heights. Persian cuisine was famous. Rich stews, roasted meats, fruits, nuts, herbs, and spices. Royal meals were elaborate, timeless, and deeply terrifying if you were a taster. A Persian food taster was not just an ordinary servant. He was part of the royal household, often paid well, housed well, given fine clothes. Which sounds lovely until you remember the job description was eat potentially lethal food and look calm while doing it. They developed a technique scholars often call the pause of fate, a short respectful waiting period after tasting each dish. During this pause, everyone watched the taster with polite intensity, looking for subtle symptoms. A twitch, a cough, a slight slump. If nothing happened, the king ate. If something did happen, the king ordered a different dinner. No one ever said the job lacked impact. Sliding over to Greece, we find the tasters again, although here they had a slightly more philosophical view of death. In true Greek fashion, they considered poisonings a moral failing on the part of the person poisoned, not the poisoner. This meant the taster was more than a safety device. They were a symbolic shield against fate. If fate intended the king to die, the poison would succeed. If not, the taster would be fine. Early Greek tastes differed by region, but none of them made poison detection easier. A taster working for a Spartan king might be sampling thick barley porridge that tasted like damp soil to begin with. Detecting poison in it would have been a challenge worthy of an oracle. Yet the tasters persisted. Quiet, steady, unnoticed unless something went terribly wrong. Now we drift into China, where food testing became a deeply ritualized practice. Chinese emperors were surrounded by strict hierarchies. Every moment of their lives was structured, choreographed, and meticulously recorded. Food testing followed the same pattern. Each dish was tasted by multiple people, sometimes 2 or 3 layers of testers. Then, after the emperor finished eating, the remaining food was sealed and stored, just in case someone needed proof later. The testers themselves were often eunuchs, men who held unusually stable positions at court because they were considered loyal, safe, and not likely to produce rival heirs. But eunuchs also knew too much. They lived in close proximity to the emperor. They were near him at his most vulnerable. They handled private matters. So they learned the same secret every servant learned. Speak little, listen always, and keep your thoughts locked away where no one can use them. Food tasters in China rarely died from poisoning. The job was more about ritual reassurance than practical danger. But their lives were still controlled, still fragile, still tied entirely to the emperor's whims. Drifting now to medieval Europe, where food testing was less organized. There were official tasters, yes, but also unofficial ones. Random servants might be handed a spoon with the royal expression of, "Try this and tell me if you stop breathing." Nobles sometimes appointed people based on loyalty. Sometimes they appointed people based on who owed them money. And sometimes they simply appointed someone because they were standing closest to the food. One of the most famous royal tasters in Europe was employed by King Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry, the one who collected wives like interesting hats and disposed of them just as easily. Henry was famously paranoid. He suspected poisoning constantly. He refused certain dishes. He blamed cooks for looking suspicious, or tired, or alive.
His taster was required to sample meat, soup, wine, bread, fruit, basically anything with a color or temperature. And the taster was watched closely the entire time. If he so much as sneezed, Henry assumed treason. It was not a relaxing work environment. But one of the most delicate and quietly dangerous taster positions existed in Renaissance Italy. Italian courts were elegant, artistic, vibrant, and full of poisoners who considered their craft a sophisticated hobby. Families like the Borgias, Medici, and Sforza were notorious for their creative approach to removing inconvenient individuals, so their tasters lived in a permanent state of gentle dread, morning dread, lunch dread, dinner dread, even dessert dread. Italian poisoners were subtle. They used powders without taste, perfumes, gloves dusted with toxic residue, even, according to some very dramatic chroniclers, poisoned candles. Whether or not the candles were real, the fear was. The tasters developed delicate instincts, a twitch of the nose, a strange tingle, a mild metallic aftertaste. They had to trust their senses, because no one else was going to protect them, and certainly not the Duke who hired them. Yet, here's the soft truth at the center of all this. Food tasters rarely died. Ancient poisonings were far less common than legends suggest. Most meals were safe. Most kings died of natural causes, illness, age, a surprising number of infections caused by medical treatments that were significantly worse than the conditions they were meant to fix. The taster's job was mostly symbolic, a living reassurance, a warm-blooded comfort, a quiet presence that told the monarch, you can relax, you are safe. Someone else is taking the risk for you. The emotional weight of that reassurance was enormous and strangely intimate. Tasters were not just servants, they were guardians, silent companions, people who stood between the monarch and the terrifying idea that someone, somewhere, wanted them gone. In a way, tasters were among the most trusted people in the palace, and the most expendable. A calm contradiction, a familiar theme in royal life. So when we ask how food tasters survived, the answer is simple, quiet, and a little sad. They survived by routine, by anonymity, by hoping every day was just like the day before. No one wanted changes, not in their position, not in the kitchen, and definitely not in the spices. A long life for a taster depended entirely on the stability of the palace. Peaceful times meant peaceful meals. Chaotic times meant early retirement, in the worst sense of the phrase. And yet, generation after generation, they showed up, tasted the food, waited politely, and continued with their day. Quiet professionals in a very specialized field.
What happened to wives of warriors who never returned from battle? The forgotten lives of living widows.
The day the warriors left. Women watched husbands march off with shields and spears, never knowing if it was the last time they'd see them alive. Weeks turned into months, when no messenger arrived, no body returned, and no rumor spread. The wives entered a strange limbo, neither married nor widowed. Widows in waiting. Many medieval societies had an unofficial title for them, women waiting for death notices. They could not remarry, could not claim property, and often lived under suspicion. Property battles began. Relatives of the missing husband frequently swooped in, claiming land, livestock, or homes, arguing the man might return and demand his belongings. Pressure from the village. Without a male head of household, these women were often treated as burdens. Some were forced into labor, others were quietly pushed toward remarriage, even without evidence the husband was dead. Survival mode. To feed children, many became weavers, bakers, midwives, or herbal healers. Some formed informal widow circles to help each other survive. The church complicated everything. In many regions, the church required proof of death, which often didn't exist, so women couldn't remarry for 7 years, sometimes even longer. Some took radical action. A few women traveled to battlefields, war camps, or foreign lands, searching for their husband's fate. Others simply declared them dead and risked punishment. When husbands returned, rare but devastating when it happened. Some returned years later, injured and unrecognizable. Others found their wives remarried and reclaimed them, children included. The legacy of ghost marriages. These stories became part of folklore, haunting songs about women trapped between loyalty and survival, waiting for men who would never return.